Hi, this is Harvey Bravman, producer director of Soul Witness, and thank you for joining us for our International Holocaust Remembrance Day um, panel discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists and our moderator for this discussion. Dena Salzberg is a second generation survivor. Her father, Hyman, is in the film Soul Witness, and her mother, as well as two uncles, were also part of the Brookline Holocaust Witness Project. Janet Bloom is also a second generation survivor. Her mother, Rose Mura, is also in the film Soul Witness and was part of the Brookline Holocaust Witness um, project. And Peggy Shukur, who is the deputy director of the New England chapter of the Anti-Defamation League. And our moderator for today, we're very honored to have Paris Alston, who is the producer of Radio Boston on WBUR. Paris, I'm going to turn the reins over to you. Really appreciate you helping us today. Thank you.
Absolutely, Harvey, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of our panelists for being with us today as well. Holocaust Remembrance Day definitely comes around once a year, and it's time for us to reflect and to think about it in the context of what we're experiencing in the current time. And there is so much going on. We definitely have a lot to discuss. So I thank everyone. I thank everyone who's tuning in as well for being part of the discussion. Um, so, my first question to the panel is essentially what we're talking about. Why is Holocaust remembrance relevant today, especially when you think about goodness, just the first 2 weeks of 2021, right? And I'll go to Dena first.
Well, I think we think of the Holocaust daily. As a child of survivors, I typically think of my parents and what they've gone through and my other relatives. And unfortunately, right now we're seeing parts of what went on during the Holocaust times coming back to us. And I keep thinking to myself when I watch the news and see, what's been happening in Washington, for instance, I think about my parents and I think like thank God they're not here to witness what's going on in DC. They loved America, and when my father came to this country, he actually went to Washington, DC, and that's where he started in this country. So I think to see all this, unrest and, you know, craziness, as he would say, makes us realize that we can't forget what went on during the Holocaust. It's with us all the time.
As a child of survivors, as Dena had said, we live through this each day knowing what our parents had experienced. They endured unimaginable pain and sorrow at the hands of perpetrators, the Nazis and the collaborators. It was unimaginable that my parents went through the Holocaust, but to see what's going on in this country now, it's very unsettling, and I'm appalled to see how people have so much hate. My parents were fearful that this could repeat itself. So we need to educate people. For someone to go around with a Camp Auschwitz shirt, they need to be taken and go firsthand to Auschwitz and speak to a survivor too, and hear the testimonies. My parents shouldn't have experienced this in vain. It was a time in history where the Jews were scapegoats and everything was blamed on them. We can't go through this again. It's just very unsettling and disturbing, for my children, grandchildren, and for future generations not to experience this. It's horrible for any race to go through this. My mother always said, we can live together if we all work together and get to know one another, not to spew hate.
You're right, Janet, and you, Dena, as well. I mean, about us, the importance of us knowing this history so that we don't repeat it. And it's interesting, Peggy, I would like to know from you, how is the ADL responding to what happened at the Capitol last week? And how are you thinking about where we go from here? Because, you know, we've been talking about this for decades, about not repeating this history, not, you know, feeding into and letting the things that lead to these sorts of insurrections happen and fester. But here we are. So where do we go? How do we deal with this now? How are you thinking about that?
I'm actually still thinking about one of the words that Janet used, which was unimaginable. So it was unimaginable then. And that's also a word we've been using to describe what happened at the Capitol last week. To some of us at ADL, and probably obviously outside of ADL, what happened was extreme last week, but not totally unimaginable. There have been signs, and plenty of signs, that the lessons of the Holocaust have not been learned, that repeated genocides that have happened since the Holocaust is a reason for concern. And on top of that, the sort of constant anti-Semitic and racial tropes that have been sort of woven through Nazi Germany have reappeared in many manifestations since that time. We can just look back less than a year ago to see those tropes sort of reemerge in new and horrific ways in connection with the coronavirus, where the Asian community was blamed in ways and the Jewish community was blamed in ways for either transmitting the virus or profiting out of the virus. So those tropes are there, but they're more insidious when people don't connect them. And one of the things we try to do at ADL is make those connections, whether it's by advocating for mandatory Holocaust and genocide education. Shout out to New Hampshire, which adopted this just last year. But also with our work on extremism, where we're kind of digging into the dark web to see those stories, to see how those lies are shared and spewed, both in sort of the alternate sites, but also in Facebook and the more traditional sites. In fact, I will note here that Facebook has been one of the places where the lie of Holocaust denial has been prominently shared and spewed, and more recently, Facebook has agreed to take that off. But that didn't happen automatically either. So unfortunately, the task of education, which is very high up on ADL's list of really important actions in relation to Holocaust remembrance and understanding the lessons of the genocide. There's much more that needs to be done. But, you know, sort of our view is that we're continuing our work in extremism, both in education and analysis, but also our direct work in schools to promote both Holocaust and genocide education, but also more broadly for anti-bias and anti-hate training, you know, for students. There's a lot of improvements I think we could all agree that could be made to our civic discourse and to giving our next generation the language both to recognize the atrocities of the Holocaust and genocide, but also have the language and ability to discuss all forms of hate and bias.
And Harvey, you know, you've been someone who's been a student and a steward of this history, right? Through your documentation of survivor witnesses, survivor stories, etc. And so what do you think is the value of having those testimonies and sharing them through film and through in person and all sorts of other ways? What is the value? I mean, I think it's easy for people to say, oh, well, this happened so long ago, you know, it seems so far away from me. But why is it important for us to hear that, to bring it back home?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that the film and other efforts like it help us to become more present, more vigilant against all forms of hate. on the day of the attack on the Capitol, on the evening of that day, Senator Cory Booker spoke on the floor of the Senate, and he was talking about that he saw the Confederate flag in the Capitol. The Confederate flag hadn't been in the Capitol even during the Civil War. And you could see the emotion in his whole body, almost in his face. And he's a strong man, and you could see him just trying to hold himself together to say that. And I remember being upset that had happened through his being upset. But the next morning, I was speaking with the director of the Holocaust Center for Pittsburgh, and she brought to my attention something that I did not know at the time, which was that some of the people that were storming the Capitol were wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts, sweatshirts. And I tell you, I wanted to throw something through my computer. I wanted to throw my computer out the window. I was so visibly, I was just so angry. I guess I hope that through the film, people will feel as upset at things like this and feel it even more because they had experienced what a survivor went through. And I wish, and I'm sure that it exists, but for all forms of hatred. At the time that I heard about the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts, I had wished that I felt that same pain when I heard about the Confederate flag. I want people to feel those things so that they want it to stop, the way Janet and Dena and I and Peggy react to something that's relevant to anti-Semitism. I hope that there's more films like this on other subjects.
Mm-hmm. And Janet and Dena, I mean, you've both had the experience of growing up in households where this was part of your family, right? This is part of your family's history. Mm-hmm. This is part of your parents' history. I'm sure, and there are testimonies in Harvey's film where people talk about the trauma that's associated with what they went through, where it's in a lifelong, inescapable trauma. And you're closer to it than some others, right? But what do you hope that people take away when they do hear these testimonies, like the ones that are in Harvey's film? What do you hope that people are understanding, maybe that they didn't necessarily get the point of view that you had, but they should understand?
I'm just concerned that they think that it's a made up story and that a bunch of people have gotten on, in front of a camera and started making up stories, because there are a lot of Holocaust deniers out there who don't think the Holocaust happened. But when you see, your parents not being able to sleep and they're crying at night and having nightmares, that's real. You can't make that up. This happened. And it may not affect you the way it affected us as children of survivors, but it was a real part of our history.
I want people to understand how people's lives were taken away from them and their identities were taken. My parents both lived with death, as they said, day in and day out, smelling the flesh and the bones and the hair from the crematorium. That doesn't leave them. And so that's what happened. And when they came to America, they were hopeful. They were hopeful to rebuild their lives. They came here with nothing. And they became patriotic. They were devoted to Israel as well. My mother would say that If they had Israel, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. And then I think of what's going on with the hatred rhetoric. And we're having a toxic environment here. We don't want this to become normalized.
I really worry about the anti-Semitism in this country. I think, there's too many excuses that are given, and they don't call it anti-Semitism, but I think there's a lot of jealousy out there about how the Jews were able to become accomplished and had, different opportunities when they came here. And it's not because they haven't gone to college or they haven't, pushed themselves, but I think because they didn't have those opportunities growing up, they found this country to be such an open country and being able to pursue interests and so forth. But I really worry for college students who are on campus and they're up against anti-Israel and BDS kinds of discussions. And we need to educate our own kids on how to, stand up for themselves and their beliefs.
These things keep happening. Like before this, I want to say it was Charlottesville, right? That made people, because there were neo-Nazis in Charlottesville and those attacks in 2018. And so when those things come up and you revisit Soul Witness, what are the things that make you say, oh no, like this is still relevant. This is a repetition of what has happened.
Well, when you hear in Charlottesville, when they are announcing Jews will not replace us, that's alarming. And then when you see what happened last week with the Camp Auschwitz shirt, and then they also had 6 MNE, which means 6 million not enough, that's appalling. That they can go around and do this and start this hatred, and it's not going to stop. I think there's an undercurrent of these hate mongers, but we need to stop it.
One of the things that I'm seeing presently that to me is even more upsetting, if that's possible, than witnessing a Capitol attack or witnessing Charlottesville is listening to our leaders, our Congress people, saying that they are fearful for their lives. If they don't vote a certain way, that something might happen to them and their family, and that those 10 congressmen, for instance, who voted for impeachment, that they were basically doing something courageous. All they were doing was voting, but what made it courageous was
you mean
that
the 10 Republican Congress people? Are you talking about the
I meant the GOP Congress people,
okay.
And probably the Democrats too, who are in purple areas, but they're putting, and then to find out from Democrat congressmen that their lives have been on the line for quite some time, outspoken leaders in Congress. And to me, that's where it starts. Your leaders start to be fearful of making the right decision. So some of them don't make the right decision. That when people start to become fearful to do the right thing in everyday life, these incidences like Charlottesville, you could stay away from Charlottesville, but you can't stay away from it when it comes to you, when it comes to your home, when it comes to your street. And that to me is, the film is meant to build awareness of what the end result of all of these things are. That's what happened in Germany. It started with people in parliament just being afraid, and then at some point the tables turned and the Nazis' evil took over. We really need to be aware that this is a very, very real threat that's happening to all of us.
Well, we're witnessing it firsthand, even televised. We're witnessing it, and we don't want our children to think, this is what people are doing. It's not normal.
I want to just kind of lastly ask you all, so with everything that went on last year, I had lots of conversations specifically about, the strand of racism in America is a very specific one, right? Because of the history that we have with slavery, with the civil rights, with the Jim Crow era civil rights issues, et cetera. And I think we brought up a number of times how the Holocaust can seem so far away. But in turn, we have this specific strand of anti-Semitism as well, right? Where it's almost like it's one where it's kind of what Peggy was getting to. It's done in cyberspace, and it's done in a kind of in the shadows, but it's still there, and maybe not even so much in the shadows, because we saw these Camp Auschwitz shirts, we saw what happened in Charlottesville, and so how would you describe that strand, right? And how do we treat that? It's almost, I hate to liken it to this, because it's almost like we've got this new COVID-19 variant, and now we're trying to figure out how we respond to that, right? But there is this specific, it's because I also think because we get this idea that because it's America, certain things won't happen here, but we're seeing that they can and that they will. So how do we respond to that?
Janet said, we're seeing things that our reaction to is it's not normal. And I think if we take a step back, or at least, if you just go back this year or the last 4 years, what is normal and what's been normalized in terms of language and how we and our reaction to things as a nation, that's really changed. A lot of things that are extremely hateful and disruptive and polarizing and divisive have been normalized. And, in times of strife, all of us, who have been students of anti-Semitism see that often Jews are targeted, often people of color are targeted. And, that leads into the reckoning that this country has had in the past 6-8 months, which is confronting, all these systems of oppression and how they manifest in our society. No easy answers, but understanding the history in the United States, that it's not as perfect as many of us grew up believing, is actually an important step. Stories of Holocaust survivors is one piece to that puzzle.
I've gotten some reaction to the film, which reminded me of, I never really thought about it, but things that my whole life, every time a Holocaust program or something came up on TV, that I would hear people saying, "Oh, not another one of those. Aren't we done with that? Can't we just move on from that?" And people have said that to me, like, "Oh, well, I'm glad that this is working out for you, but isn't there enough programming on the Holocaust?" And it also makes me think of when people say, can't we get over that, people were lynched? Can't we get over that, someone, that your father had to accept that he would, as a grown man, he was, someone could say boy to him, call him boy, and he couldn't say anything back, so that there's that wanting to forget the horrors that humans inflict on each other. And then also these other big lies of, an election was rigged or something like that. And sort of trying to study this stuff, the one thing that's really been illuminating for me is that fascism, it seems like fascism comes about through the will of the people because they believe lies.
I like to believe that the counterbalance to it is a democracy that allows people to speak up in opposition, that a free press that helps bring out facts is another way where people are educated, and the sort of the better angels will take over. But I think some of those areas that we've traditionally relied on to sort of keep things in balance have been skewed. And in addition to our free and fair press, there's just a lot of media out there that people are tuning into that just isn't accurate and actually contributes to this division, this divisiveness, and this hate that we're seeing now acted on.
Well, what is your hope? I mean, because I know that we had lots of education going. We have material like Harvey's film. We have people like Dena and Janet's parents whose testimonies do live on. And so, what makes you hopeful in all of that we can turn this around, or maybe we are at a point of no return?
I think what Janet said is true. We need to talk to each other. I mean, you said that at the very beginning.
We can't erase this part of history. As Harvey just said, isn't this enough? It's not enough. If we don't talk about it and just let it go, it's repeating itself as it is, but we need to bring it to the forefront. And I know that the torch has been passed, like to Dena and to myself, and the second and the third generation, that our children and grandchildren will continue the legacy about their parents and grandparents. We cannot let this stay silent. Never again is resounding louder than ever, that we need to work and act upon it. And it's up to each of us to voice our outrage.
I also think that we need to reach out to the leadership of these groups too. It's amazing how they've been able to identify so many of the people that were at the Capitol and going out into communities and arresting them. These are like normal people that could be living next door to any of us. And I think getting to the leadership is very, very important as well.
When I was in school in the 20th century, I didn't have anything about the Holocaust in my education books, in my history books. I went to school in Boston. I would ask my parents about it. They would talk about it. But it wasn't until I started in college, and then the movie Holocaust came about, and people were more aware of it. But I know that there are statistics asking people if they ever heard of Auschwitz. Many people don't know, or they're not aware of what happened. Mm-hmm. So educating the children is important, but educating the parents as well.
We only have, I think, under 20 states that have adopted mandatory genocide education. And I'm sad to say Massachusetts is not one of them. And when we talk about the connections between the Holocaust and other forms of genocide, and either ignorance or willful looking at alternate facts, there is a crying need to provide education, and education really at the right time in someone's life, so that it becomes really part of their values and is aligned really with what we hope the next generation learns about civic duty and democracy, and speaking out against all forms of hate that we see in our communities.
You mentioned, Paris, what positive things that we can take away from this. I've been interviewing young people for the past 11 years, and their social justice initiatives, started by high school students and college students. And that just sort of invigorates me, and hopefully it invigorates other people. And also we have impeached the president, and the Capitol attack was not successful. It did a lot of damage, but it wasn't successful. And I think there are more people that want to defend democracy than want to tear it down. and democracy takes constant defending. And I think through these volleys that have been launched at democracy, people have become more active and more aware. And maybe the last 4 years, while it's hard to say that it was good, I think that we were in a very similar situation 4 years ago, and maybe we didn't realize it. And now it's more real for everyone. And I do have hope, and I do think that people want a better way. And I think our democracy is strong because for whatever reasons that it held up during these attacks the last 4 years, and there are going to be more. But I think if we stay together, we can have a better country.
I'm hoping that this moment will make those of us who want to be part of the good fight here to kind of renew our efforts into standing up, feeling empowered to get out facts, feeling empowered to advocate for more education for laws, advocate in the political spectrum as well, and really use the democratic processes, which I believe still exist in this country, to sort of move forward and be a good ally actually with all the groups who have been sort of victimized by a lot of the hatred that's woven through our country. We all collectively can use our own experiences, and this one is probably one of the most compelling and powerful to illustrate that, and illustrate also some resilience as we move forward. So we can draw on that, and hopefully it will give us strength. And instead of talking about the extremist groups who are emboldened to act on their beliefs, I'm hoping that us as good people can be emboldened and have our day to move these issues forward.
For what all of you said, there are some positive spots there, and I think it's just a big reminder that the work isn't done. It's never going to be done. We're going to keep having to listen to these witness testimonies. We're going to have to keep educating people. We're going to have to keep documenting stories and putting them in the context of today. And so I think that's a task we can take on.
Well said.
Well, Harvey, Dena, Janet, and Peggy, thank you all so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danielle Myers of ADW Video Productions and BrooklineHub.com. BrooklineHub.com is a 501c3 nonprofit online publication dedicated to community building through local reporting and events. Brookline Facing Civil Rights was produced by our founder, Harvey Bravman. The film is about the experiences of African Americans who helped break the wall of segregation that existed in Brookline before the civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s. Last year, the film sold out the Coolidge Corner Theater and included a panel discussion on inclusivity. You can stream the film and the discussion on BrooklineHub.com in exchange for a donation to the Brookline Community Foundation's Safety Net Fund. You can also stream Soul Witness, a film that features interviews with Brookline Holocaust survivors conducted 30 years ago, on soulwitness.org.